This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 124. How is privatisation working out for you?
Welcome to the Debunking Economics Podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Today, in the UK, we've privatised the railways, coach companies, the banks, power, airports, the Royal Mail, water, BT, car companies. There's actually not much left to sell. So how are these privatised companies working out for us? We'll look at the issue of privatisation today on the Debunking Economics Podcast. So, Steve, the privatisation of railways in Britain, that's a good place to start on all of this. It's one of the legacies of Margaret Thatcher, although she was gone long before it was enacted. But we know what happened. It was split into regional franchises. We had two freight companies. We had Railtrack that was also privatised that maintained the infrastructure. But then that was brought back into public hands because we had that big crash in Hatfield in October 2000, which was caused by a broken rail. And, they were fined for that, but also they needed more government money to improve standards. And in the end, that significant part of the privatisation story, the actual infrastructure itself, came back into public hands. So running trains across those lines still stayed, but the East Coast Main Line is now back in public hands because it wasn't profitable for Virgin Rail. This is the third time in a decade the company running that route has failed to meet the contractual obligations. Yet, Steve, many still argue rail privatisation is a success. I'm not quite sure how they argue it, but they give it a damn good go.
I'd like to hear too. I mean, this is one of the things that I find quite hilarious with all the moving I do between Europe and the UK, because when I get to the UK, one of the things I brace myself for is, pardon the French, shitty carriages, overcrowded, bad infrastructure, ugly stations. And I know when I get back to Europe, I'm going to have, normally speaking, I don't think I've actually had to stand up. I've stood up once, pardon me, in a European train. That was because I think there'd been a cancellation of all flights due to high winds. And for quality carriages and quality infrastructure. Yeah. The contrast couldn't be bigger.
And they're all state-owned. And yet, they weren't that great here, I have to say, before privatisation either. So, not a lot's changed. But so Ian King, who's the business presenter on Sky News, he wrote on this. He gave the argument for privatisation. He says 1.6 billion rail journeys are made annually, more than double the number before privatisation, while the volume of freight carried on the rails is up 80% since privatisation. He said it's also hard to see how renationalisation would solve the main passenger complaints, which are delays, overcrowding and high ticket prices. He said many delays are up to two-thirds increase depending on the route. And he's saying many of the delays, about two-thirds depending on the route, are caused not by the private operators but by Network Rail, which is already state-owned. So has he got a point? Don't see, if we were to follow the Labour route, the Jeremy Corbyn route, and renationalise the railways, would fares actually drop? Only with big government subsidies, presumably.
Well, I think this is one of the things government can do, because as I said, government should be spending into the economy. I'd far rather spend into the economy by building decent rail infrastructure than hiring bureaucrats at universities to tell me whether I'm doing decent research or not. So there is.
I'm glad you got that in there.
I know, I'm particularly pissed. I had a bad experience last week with all this crap. Well, several bad experiences, and it's just, I want government spending to occur in ways that is actually beneficial.
Well, the crazy thing is the government is subsidising these rail companies, of course.
As well. Yeah, they're not making profit. Yeah, it wasn't a source of profit as they thought it might be. And of course, the dream, this 80% increase. How long ago would the privatisation occur?
In the early 90s, wasn't it, that it finally took in? So yes,
I think there may have been about an 80% increase in the nominal value of the UK economy since 1990, just roughly speaking, 20-something years ago.
Well, there's the thing: is he talking in real terms or not? I'm not sure. You can always create compelling numbers if you forget the effects of inflation, can't you? So maybe he's doing a bit of that as well. But look, we don't have to look too far. Transport for London was never nationalised. It was never privatised. It's a nationalised operation. The cost of, I worked it out, it's quite high. The cost of subsidy for Transport for London is basically 50 pence per journey. So every time you get on the tube, even though tube fares are pretty expensive, the government's paying 50 pence. But if you look at it in another way, that 50 pence is 50 pence which is not spent handling congestion on the roads, maintaining the roads, and the pollution effects as well. And that's the thing with transport, isn't it? You've got to look at it holistically.
Yeah, and this is what's never been done. It is people have to move from one point to another somehow, and if you actually had to do that in an entirely privatised basis, the cost would be enormous. So that is one classic case where the state can come along and say we can spread these costs more broadly and finance it out of our capacity to create money as well. And that we need to do that anyway. So let's just think we create money in a useful fashion rather than by maybe setting up interrogation gulags for migrants, which is another way they can create money.
We've got a bizarre situation. We've got some of these rail companies, like Southwestern Railways, is largely owned by the Hong Kong Rail Authority, which is largely owned by a foreign government.
Yeah, then they take the French and German governments own large slabs of the so-called privatised country. But what they don't do, and this is where the argument for privatisation for things like transportation falls down completely, even on its own neoclassical basis. The idea about privatisation improving services assumes that you're going to have a whole bunch of firms competing for a service. When you make a geographic franchise, as the rail system has to be, so you got, was it Southwest Rail who goes to Brighton?
Southern Rail goes to Brighton.
Southern Rail, okay.
Sometimes, not always.
That's right. That's probably the most complained about
Southern
service.
Rail, it occasionally goes to Brighton. It's probably the best way to describe it.
Yeah. Occasionally, you get a scenic journey on the way. You're seeing the ass of the person in front of you sitting down. Yeah, it is just there's no possibility for competition there. The competition is, okay, why don't you drive? Which is another, or fly. I mean, it is simply impossible to have the fantasy of competitive markets applying in a geographic franchise, which is what a rail system necessarily has to be.
So is that it? Is that where we determine what makes sense and what doesn't? Is it geography? If in privatising something we have to give a geographic monopoly, then it's a bad idea. If there's not that geographic monopoly, then we can look at it seriously.
To some extent. I mean, for example, one classic area where it makes absolute sense to have public ownership of the infrastructure with private suppliers competing for it is something like the internet.
Yeah.
You want to have a network which goes to every last house in the country as cheaply as possible. And I'll give you my favorite example there, by the way.
I'm not sure I agree with you on this, but I'll let you finish your point. Yeah.
Okay. It makes sure the service goes to every physical building in the country. And then you don't care how much it costs. You may do it by publicly. You might say the private groups have to do it themselves. But then you have competition for supplying the services along that backbone. And guess which country I'm thinking of that did this?
Well, you're thinking of Australia as trying to do that. All right, okay.
No, South Korea.
All right, okay. Yeah. Very densely populated country, of course. So it's a lot easier to do there. I'm not sure I totally agree with you. So if you've got somebody who lives in a hut in the Shetland Islands, does the government pay to connect up that house to the internet, or do we actually say, well, that is clearly going to cost a lot of money. If you really want to be on the internet, you've got to leave your hut. You've got to at least move to a town in the Shetlands.
Well, you have to certainly vary the type of technology you use, but you want to get the fastest possible service you can, and not impose the cost on the individuals, because then what you get is the sort of concentration you're talking about.
Right. The other side of that argument as well is, and this is the interesting case, because I mean that we are the case study behind all of this, of course, is what happened and what went wrong with the national broadband network in Australia.
Oh, let's not forget Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull in that one.
No, but I mean, the whole idea of that was that the government should provide the national backbone infrastructure that you're talking about, like in South Korea, and then retailers would just sit on top of it. But that's not the way it works, and it's cost a lot of money. There's been a huge amount of time spent arguing about cost subsidization between regional centres and capital cities. If you look at the UK, the internet industry is streets ahead without that regulation. In fact, in our street, and we're in just on the edge of the countryside here in Surrey, we've got Virgin Media wanting to run cable down our road, which is already cabled up by BT, but they want to provide an alternative infrastructure, and why shouldn't they? if it's economic for them to do so.
I think,
So this argument of infrastructure competition, I used to be dead against. I was thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. That's what the telecoms industry calls an overbuild. But if two companies believe that they can sustainably compete against each other, why not let them?
It depends on you don't need to
You don't need to, no.
Okay, because the capacity is so great and growing, exponentially over time anyway. It's a waste in that sense. You're better off to say, we want you to, if you want to compete, get together, provide the cable. There's no need for two of those cables.
But they're never going to do that. I know. There's no need, but they're never going to do that because one of them.
That's what the South Koreans did. This is the point I was getting to earlier. The South Korean government basically told the telecommunications companies, I think they had some government involvement in them as well, but they were basically told, we don't care how much it costs, you've got to do it. You want to operate in this country, you've got to provide telecommunications backbone to every. And the funny way that I saw this, I found out about it, was that I had, and you called me a Marxist in the last program, if I remember rightly. Well, I actually had a genuine, really cardboard cutout Marxist come to visit me in Australia. He was the head of the Marxist political party in South Korea.
Did he have the beard?
He did. Anyway, he came to see me and spent about a couple of months, having a go at me. But we got on well. But he was very old-fashioned Labour theory of value type, which of course I'm not. And but he got me to get him accommodation. And when I got the apartment for him, he got out his laptop and he was walking around the laptop, carrying the laptop with an Ethernet cable in his hand, trying to find a plug. And I had to tell him, this is back in 1990 or something like that. I just said, there is no Ethernet cable in this house. He said, what? And he was stunned because even as a Marxist, he just took it for granted the government would tell the companies to provide this service to whoever he had. But that's what happened in South Korea.
Right.
Now that's of course where we talk about major South Korean telecommunications. That's why the kids who were playing in those rooms now run Samsung and the like.
I find it very hard to believe that a non-privatized BT or a non-privatized Telstra would be pushing ahead with cutting edge technology if they didn't have to, if they still had a monopoly, or if they had competitors who didn't have the same advantages that they have in owning that last mile.
Yeah, they've got to be forced into it. But it's again that they were. I think the companies in South Korea were basically compelled to get together to provide a cable. The rule was there had to be T1, was it what's called T100, the old standard for Ethernet connections?
Yeah, a T1 connection, yeah.
Had to be a T1 connection to every building in the country. Okay, now that worked. And of course, Samsung and so on are brilliant. The reason the Australian system stuffed up so much, as you and I both know, is Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Bloody Abbott stuck their political noses into the whole thing to try to undermine Kevin Rudd. And Malcolm, who should know better, and you know he should know better because you know him, did Tony's becking and went from having the idea of having cable to the premises to cable to the node, which completely hamstrung the quality of the system in Australia.
Yeah, but the problem was they were trying to make it pay for itself as well, which would have given
the other problem.
Would have given Australia the most expensive internet in the world, whether you used it a little or not at all, or used it a lot. So, okay, well, we might argue about the level of whether it's been good in the telecommunications space. I mean, you'd have to argue competition would be good in the telecommunications space, but it's just where it sits. Health is a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? But, although, again, it's an interesting one. So the UK is the NHS is almost a religion in the UK. Health is largely in public hands. And if you look at the costs, I mean, the cost of healthcare for every person in the UK averages out less than £3,000 a year. In the United States, it's £7,600 per person, and their life expectancy is lower. So they're paying more than twice the amount, and they're getting a worse service at the end of the day. So we look at the problems with the NHS, and there's attempts to try and break out bits of it and privatise bits of it. But if you go the whole way of the of the US system, you've got a far less efficient approach.
Yeah, because this is, again, one reason that the whole idea of competition theory does make any sense in its own right, but it makes even less sense when you apply it to things like health, because it implies you're going to go and shop around. Now, if you're told you have terminal cancer, you're going to try to get the best damn surgeon you get. You're not going to, when you I mean, the whole idea of the lower price means the competition will drive the price down. And, you're going to charge me $2,000, $3,000 for that operation. This is going to charge me $500. I'll go for the $500 doctor. No damn way. You say, you're going to charge me $500? This is my life case. Who's the guy's going to charge me $3,000? Who's going to do a better job? You take price as a quality indicator. So, and then what also gets caught up is because you have private competition going on here, most of the expenses go in bloody marketing. And the whole idea that getting rid of the public system and going to the private is going to reduce the costs. So you've got all these inefficient administrators. I have no doubt they're in it. I've seen a few inefficient administrators in publicly run systems. But if you make it privatized, what you get is inefficient marketers instead. And I'd rather have the inefficient bureaucrats than the bloody marketers trying to sell their health product versus the other health product to you.
But what are all the marketers going to do, Steve? What I mean, they're going to be unemployed. We know there's a planet for them called Gilgafranchin. If you know your Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy, put them all on those in the telephone sanitizers, put them on a ship. Telephone sanitizers first, absolutely. So what about so energy is another interesting one, isn't it? So because the privatization of energy companies, the result of that, again, it does get down to marketing, doesn't it? Because we've seen confusing price plans which are designed to trap people who don't churn, basically. If you don't check on the plan every year, we're going to gradually move you on to a slightly worse one. If you want to switch, we'll make sure you get a good deal. Or if you ask about switching, we'll make sure you get the best deal that's available. In other words, we'll put low entry prices, but if you don't bother getting back in touch with us, the price is going to keep on going up. And that's marketing, sadly. And Ofgem, which is the energy industry regulator, has now said, well, we're going to introduce a price cap. So it's a privatized industry, but the government is putting a lot of control in. So the typical user now should use no more than £1,137 a year. This is kicking in the UK at the start of next year. So, but that's for the typical user. So the moment you start to do this, the government gets involved. It gets very complicated, doesn't it? Because what happens if you're not a typical user? What if you use 50% more? Do they have to put another cap on for 50% more? In which case, or do the companies say, well, no, we haven't got, you're not a typical user, so we're going to start charging you at a steeper rate, in which case the caps achieve nothing. Or the government says, no, we're going to put other points in which case they are being very prescriptive of retail prices. So there's no room for innovation. It achieves nothing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and it's even worse if you look at the actual the wholesale market that lies behind this, because again, the idea that privatization would lead to greater efficiencies and so on ignored the whole marketing issue to begin with, but it also ignores one thing which is absolutely essential for products like electricity, and that is you don't want it to fail.
Yeah.
You want absolute engineering caliber there, and if you bring in private companies, they will often let that slip. But at the same time, one thing I know from the Australian wholesale energy market is that the price, because they've got a totally market-driven price there, depending on volumes of demand from Queensland versus volume of demand from Victoria and shifting between one place and another and so on, the wholesale price can hit well over $1,000 a kilowatt. And then other times fall as low as, down to $10 a kilowatt, that sort of range. It's an incredibly volatile operation. And if you don't have your plant operating for I think it's about 3 days of the year, in terms of where those really high price spikes exist, you don't make a profit. So what you've got is everybody's encouraged to put a larger margin in to try to spread that capacity to make a profit across the whole system. It's a dog's breakfast. And the intention was to bring the system into retailers. So to go, having successfully, inverted commas, converted the wholesale market to a free-floating price auction system, then you do the same thing at the retail level. Now, when they realise that might mean that you turn your 2-bar radiator on one night in winter, you end with a bill for $1,000 for the day. They realised they simply politically couldn't do it. So we get this total mess of a completely privatised, completely free price system, extremely volatile, far more volatile than economic theory ever even could imagine prices being for wholesale electricity. And then all these crazy caps, and people, as I've seen, the Australian Institute came out recently with a paper by Richard Dennis talking about how he has 5 or 6 different companies all competing to supply very, very different electrons to him for his...
Our electrons are so much more efficient. Yeah, exactly.
Personality. Ours have got spin and charm. Yours haven't got spin and charm.
It's those mice, those damn marketers again. So what, I mean, the danger is, though, I mean, we talked about lots of examples here of stuff that should be in government hands. Should there be any, so should they just be holus bolus in government hands? Is there any room for competition in any of these industries?
I think it comes down to the two major determinants. Economies of scale and network effects are pretty much the issues you need to look at. No. And also reliability. So if you need 100% reliability for something, then you simply, you don't rely upon competitive pressures because there's, and the classic here, by the way.
A lot of people would also say you don't rely on the government doing it as well.
Well, no, you want overbuild. You want overbuild in this particular area. So my favourite example of the perils of privatisation is a wonderful book by a mate of mine called Chris Scheel, he's a historian at the University of New South Wales, and the title is Waters Fall. And it's pretty heavy try to pun there. But he went through the impact of privatisation of water and sewerage services in Australia in great detail. And the classic is the story of what's known as if you tell me, stop me if you've smelt this before. Have you heard of the Adelaide Pong?
No.
Okay.
I'm just adding it to my list of reasons not to go there. But
Okay, I've just lost 5 subscribers at Adelaide, thanks. Anyway, Adelaide privatised its sewage system, and it happened. Adelaide's pretty much heavily affected by the prevailing weather.
Yeah,
being a desert state, and the sewage treatment tanks happened to be upwind, the prevailing wind most of the time of Adelaide, and I think it was a French company that got the contract for the sewage treatment works, and to increase their short-term profits, they neglected the maintenance on the bacteria in the treatment ponds, and finally, the anaerobic bacteria killed all the aerobic. There wasn't enough oxygen in the mix, and for about 6 months to a year, Adelaide was beneath what was called the big pong, courtesy of the failure of the privatised group, because one way they could increase their short-term profits was by neglecting long-term maintenance. Now, you don't want that in something as essential as sewage or water or electricity.
So it just became a cesspit rather than a sewage works, in effect. So,
in effect.
So where does this... Where do we draw the line on all of this? because I could give just for example, airports are often privately run now. Airlines that used to be in government hands are now normally privately run. Banks, obviously, another example. I mean, where do we draw the line and say, well, okay, the post office is another example. Where is it good and where is it bad?
I think there's no hard and fast, but you certainly start absolute 100% reliability, and what's likely to be the incentives for a private versus a public institution in that area. And that's the thing I come down and say it should be public, because you want the reliability. You don't want the electricity to fail during operations in a hospital, okay? You don't want electricity to fail, period. So you want 100% reliability of the electric system. I
quite like my aircraft to be reliable as well.
I'm
happy to fly on a private airline.
The private airlines, well, the thing is, when they fail, they really fail. So that's
But probably that would be the same whether it was government owned or not, though. That's. That's an example, isn't it? Where because the whole company's reputation is based on how many people have managed to. That's survive
right.
Last year.
Yeah, and it's something which the bad operators get driven out pretty rapidly, and they don't come back. Whereas in banking, of course, we haven't seen that particularly happening. But you look at the economy, the absolute reliability is needed. You need the economies of scale. Are they extreme, and therefore is scale better? So the bigger the better. So in that case, you don't want to have competitors. You want to have one major source. It therefore should be the government, because they won't price gouge. And then the network effects. The network effects extreme, and often that can end up meaning, well, this should be privatised, because if you look at things like you were giving the example of cable being laid in different locations. When you have extremely dense population areas, then sometimes it does make sense to say, let's allow competitors to come here and offer multiples. But in the same time, you don't want to be in a part of the country where there isn't internet, because the guy in the Orkney Islands couldn't afford to have it, and you have a breakdown and you're going to die of cold, and you haven't got any internet connection to call an ambulance. You want that reliability spread widely.
Right, but here's a crazy situation on that. So in Australia, you've got cross-subsidisation of the government is building the national broadband network, and they're building it in regional, building it to every home in Australia, in effect, in one form or another. It's obviously costing more to get people who are living out in the sticks than it is to get people who are living in the cities. Companies said, well, but we want to compete in the contestable areas. So the government is saying, well, okay, now we'll let you do that, but you have to pay the cross-subsidy amount. The same as we are. So in effect, people in the cities are forced to pay higher prices, and it's not an insignificant sum. It's something like $5 or $7 per month per connection. It has to be paid at the wholesale level by those companies that are putting in alternate infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, again, that is something which it comes down to, are you a society or not? And if you are a society, then you provide that services across your society as best you can. Again, I'll use Kerry Packer as an example in one of our last podcasts. Kerry is a classic. He actually died, as you and I both know, during a polo match. And the reason he was still alive to talk about it, and of course say that he didn't see any starry gates when he was dead,
was because his helicopter pilot gave him a bodily part.
No, that was well before that happened. He actually had a heart attack and was going to die.
The defibrillator. Yeah, you've told me the story before.
The ambulance had a defibrillator, and it just happened to be he was lucky enough to have a heart attack near an ambulance which had a defibrillator attached.
Yeah.
And he then said, do they all have this? And the guy said, no, they don't. And he says the next day, he's just said, I'm going to provide a defibrillator for every ambulance in the country. Well, there's
a private operator helping helping a government provided service, of course.
Yeah, and that's so why Kerry Packer isn't the. I've got a bit more time for Kerry Packer as one of Australia's billionaires than some of the others these days.
So the post office in the UK. Yeah, sorry, you finish off your point. Sorry,
he recognised that need.
Yeah.
You don't know when you're going to have the heart attack, okay? Yeah. And in that sense, as a society, you want to have it available everywhere.
So the post office works pretty well in the UK. It's horrendously expensive to post letters here, but in Australia, the post office is still in government hands. It's cheaper, but the letters take forever. I've had letters that haven't been delivered. I think Australia Post is pretty holus, bolus, inefficient, whereas I think the UK postal service is expensive but quick. You know, you'll post something 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening and you'll find it's at the other end of the country the next morning. And it actually made a profit last year. First time in a decade, but they must be doing something right, and they look like they're benefiting from being in private hands, even though they're sort of a monopoly.
That can happen, but again, it's the structure of the network itself. You got to look at it and say what part of this network is going to be too expensive for private operators to make a profit out of. The government has to provide it and generate and fund it itself through its money creation capability. Plus, it's sharing of the burdens of providing physical resources across the whole of the population, even though the people are providing that don't get necessarily the direct benefit. And what are parts that you want a band of people competing with each other, or you want franchises operating? There's no straightforward, hard and fast answer, but certainly it isn't that everything should be privatised, which of course was the ideology that Maggie Thatcher began this whole experience with.
For two reasons she gave, and many people since her, that, the case for privatisation is it improves service quality somehow magically. Not seeing that with South Western Railways, I must admit, and it saves taxpayers money.
Yeah, well, a lot of it was shifting costs off trying to shift costs off the books of the government to make it look like the government can run a surplus. I regard that as insanity in the first place. The government should be running a deficit and creating part of the money supply of the economy. And one way to run that deficit is to pay for the cost of things like infrastructure, broadband, health services, et cetera, which people will get benefit out of, independent of their position in the market economy. Right. So
that's a two-stage. This is a two-stage argument. You've got to win there, though, with the neoclassic economists, isn't it? I just wonder whether there's a simpler argument about not saving taxpayers money without saying, well, actually, we've got to look at the whole question of tax and whether the government should run a deficit or not.
Yeah. But also, I mean, the classic thing, though, in terms of the quality of service, the quality of marketing is much better. But the quality of service, my God, it's dreadful.
Well, there we are. As I say, it's great jobs for lots of marketers. The final point, I guess, in all of this is the whole question about innovation. So we've got Elon Musk with his space exploration. He's got a Tesla orbiting the sun. Private enterprise sometimes does do stuff better, doesn't it, if it's doing new stuff?
Well, there's a combination of things. This is where two of the best books, intellectual books on how innovation occurs, one by Mariana Mazzucato talking about the role of the state as an entrepreneur, the entrepreneurial state, and saying that often the state is the one which will provide research funding for totally blue sky ideas, which ultimately come back and benefit everybody. And the other is Bill Janeway with a book called Doing Capitalism in the Entrepreneurial Economy, I think it's called. And Bill talks about venture capitalists and how their role in funding. Now, Bill and Mariana, I believe, are friends. This is not that they're putting two opposing arguments together. They're both looking at different ends of the same elephant. And what unites them both is they say that innovation occurs when people can afford the risk of failure. Now, there's two extremes which can afford the risk of failure.
You can't do that in the government.
You can do that. You should be able to do it in the government.
Yeah, but generally you can't.
Well, the government can't allow the failures. Every failure creates another 100 bureaucrats to make sure the failure doesn't happen again. But if, for example, building things like NASA, where you're told you've got to get a rocket to the moon, and we don't care about the cost, then you make your failures in the enormous cost you incur in the first instance for no profit. And then out of that, we get all the benefits. Now, Elon Musk is the first one. And he said, I've literally seen tweets by him acknowledging this. He wouldn't have achieved what he has achieved without NASA. And not just building on what NASA did, but actual contracts with NASA. And what you have is the government's the only institution which can take on the enormous costs that develop at the very first stage of something like space exploration. But once the government's done that loss leading and the technology becomes more commonplace and you can actually hire rocket engineers by putting an ad on Google, you get to the stage where the private institutions can come in, and then you can get the points where people like the innovation that Musk has been doing and how fast he alters the rockets on virtually a flight-by-flight basis. NASA, once it got them working, this is where your point about fear of failure came in. Once they worked, that was it. They stuck with the model they had at that point. They wouldn't continue innovating. So you need a mixture of the two.
So, a final question then. Are you a Corbynista? Do you believe that a lot of what's already been privatised should be pulled back into public hands, like the railways?
In the railways, definitely. I mean, this is the railways.
And utilities like electricity and gas?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the electricity and gas, you want them to be reliable and running all the time. And of course, Australia is a classic example again of the disasters of privatising a gas service. They've got the most expensive gas on the planet with the world's largest resources of gas at the same bloody time. So yes, I would like to have those things brought back into the public ownership again. And then we make intelligent decisions about when we make changes like this rather than our decisions based purely on ideology, which was the original basis of privatisation.
And of course, we had banks that were effectively renationalised because the government bought them back after the financial crisis, but didn't change their behaviour or their structure in any sense.
No penalty for the chief executives either. No, I would like to have one public bank, definitely, in every country at least, and a lot of community banks, having a different range of ownership and management structures in banking, and a range of different areas. One of the dangers of this whole privatisation philosophy versus the other extreme, which is total state ownership, of course, they're both monocultures. You don't have the variety to give you innovation and challenge. And this is the... it's debates which you said, should we have a forest consisting just of pines or just of eucalypts? Maybe you get a better situation where you have an ecosystem of different types, which that the variety of systems compete with each other and get you innovation and change out of that. In the standard privatisation versus government ownership, you've got two monocultures intellectually competing with each other. They're both wrong.
Now, I wish I knew the Samaritan's number for people who are in distress and need help, but if you are a marketing manager and you do feel distressed, there is help available. Good to talk, Steve. We'll catch you again very soon.
Okay, mate. Bye.
And that's it for this time. Not sure what we're going to talk about next time, but we're never short of ideas. But your ideas are also welcome as well. If there's something you'd like us to discuss, then leave a comment or get in touch with us through the usual channels. Till next time, I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Have yourself a great day.